Let's talk Mr. Jefferson or Mark Jefferson, some of the details we know about his character thus far, and some potential theories about his role in the game and the possible revelations awaiting us in episode 5. Of course, there are spoilers ahead for episodes 1 to 4, so if you have yet to play, I recommend you do, or watch a playthrough to get your own feel of the game, then head back to this theory. Though Mark Jefferson's photography career took him away for some time, he was originally from Arcadia Bay. It's known his work has been published in high-profile magazines and that he's also published his own books, and so we take from this and the word of others that his career was largely successful. Some of his work can be seen displayed around Blackwell in the main campus area and of course inside his classroom. He picked up a teaching position presumably in 2013, though we don't know when specifically. His class seems to consist mostly of girls who openly admire him and are attracted to him. His age is unknown, though it can be assumed he is around middle-aged. Mr. Jefferson can be charismatic. He's quite the smooth talker. He is clearly in a position of power, not just as an authority figure, as a teacher, but also over these teenage girls who admire his success and hang on to his words and opinions. He presents the image of being passionate about teaching and helping his students reach their potential, but he's shown a few occasions of lacking real empathy and signs that he may not be all that genuine or sincere. We know after episode 4 that he's quite an adept liar. He's been covering his tracks and avoiding suspicion by using his influence over the students and staff at Blackwell as well as within the community. A good example of this is Max. No matter what Mr. Jefferson says or does, it's only us as a player who gets a weird vibe. Even when we try to blame him for Kate's suicide or suicide attempt, Max only continues to feel bad for doing so, not even questioning the weird moment when he tells Principal Wells that Max didn't answer Kate's calls, which in my playthrough was a blatant lie. I cannot explain how frustrating this is for me. Max literally admires him so much that he could just about do anything and she still wouldn't suspect him. We start episode 1 in the classroom after Max wakes up from her tornado vision. This is the lesson we hear going on in the background.
Seriously though, I could frame any one of you in a dark corner and capture you in a moment of desperation. And any one of you could do that to me. Isn't that too easy?
Now, this has been thoroughly discussed already, so I will only briefly touch on it. The first photographer whose work is discussed and who brings up probably the biggest clue about his motives in the darkroom is Diane Arbus. Diane Arbus was an American photographer whose work revolved a lot around deviant and marginal people, and I'm quoting here, people whose maladies seemed ugly or surreal, though many cite her work to have only become as big after her suicide. So, back to his opinion. She saw humanity as tortured, right? And frankly, it's bullshit. I could frame any one of you in a dark corner in a moment of desperation, and you could all do the same to me. But isn't that too easy? Too obvious? What if Arbus chose to capture them at the height of their beauty and innocence? Okay, so slight hint at the reason for photographing the girls the way that he does and why he does. Now, innocence is subjective. It could mean many things, but considering the large difference in personality between Kate and Rachel, let's just assume for him being young and naive in itself is innocence. And, of course, since they are teenagers, they could be considered at the height of their beauty. But again, since this has been thoroughly discussed, let's move on. He then goes on to say he prefers the work of Robert Frank, who captured the era of post-war beat America, and talked about Robert Frank's connection with Jack Kerouac. So, very briefly, to give you an idea of what he's talking about, Robert Frank is yet another American photographer who held a friendship with and worked with Jack Kerouac. Robert Frank's work is said to have challenged the rules of photography, as his work emphasized on feeling. Jack Kerouac is an American novelist and poet who was big in the post-war beat culture in his time. Beat culture, again very briefly, celebrated nonconformity and spontaneous creativity, some of its central elements being sexual exploration and liberation, rejection of materialism, the spiritual quest, and explicit portrayals of the human condition. These photographers, of course, also took pictures in black and white, which Mr. Jefferson does seem to have an affinity for. Frankly, episode 1 doesn't give you much to go on in terms of suspecting him. I just personally found him somewhat off, but it wasn't until this one moment in episode 2 that I was totally reassured in my initial gut feeling about him. It's not evidence he's done anything sinister, rather, it crossed a very clear line for me, implying to another student that Kate's story is questionable because she protests too much, in my opinion, is a professional and moral no-no. With his power and influence, it's hardly his place professionally to call Kate's character and actions into question, especially not to other students, regardless of reason. The tone to the conversation he has with Kate right before this almost feels personal and harsh. This to Kate must have been extremely hurtful. You can even see in Max's journal entry that Kate really admires him. Basically, what he has tried to do is take away her credibility, to turn Max away from digging further into what happened with Kate the night of the party. Not only that, but he also does the same to Max. If she shares the information she knows about Nathan Prescott having a gun, Mr. Jefferson almost berates her, very obviously showing he doesn't believe her story and stating that she's difficult to believe because there seems to be a lot of drama around her. Again, this is remarkably unprofessional in my opinion. Regardless of Max's reputation, which is relatively spotless, a teacher should be taking a neutral stance in a situation like this, and I doubt they're taught to disregard such heavy and serious accusations based off of how much drama a student has surrounding them at the time. Now, if you played episode 4, you probably already have the idea that Mr. Jefferson somehow is majorly involved in whatever goes on in the darkroom. The main question now being, what the heck are his motives? What would a man like Mr. Jefferson, who is already wealthy, powerful, admired, and respected by the community, gain from all this? I'm going to take a leap here, and I say this is a leap because, of course, we don't have any direct proof, and also because I am in no way capable of diagnosing mental disorders. I'm not, nor am I trying to. I am merely sharing the facts of why I think what I think and why it could fit. I think there are two plausible motives to consider, given the dark tone of episode 4. He was either being forced into all of this, which is highly unlikely in my opinion, but still a small possibility, or he's a psychopath who is either partnered with the Prescotts or using Nathan's clear weaknesses to use him as a means to get access to the Prescotts' money and power. Now, if he's being forced, it takes away reason for seeking out Mr. Jefferson's motives. Obviously, we'd be more interested in the motivations of those who have power over him, the Prescotts. And since this isn't about the Prescotts, though I will discuss them in a future video, let's discuss the latter theory. It would make perfect sense for Mr. Jefferson to come back to Arcadia Bay, an incredibly small town that he's familiar with, where his reputation is solid, he's highly respected, and where his actions could go totally unnoticed. Nathan Prescott, who is virtually invulnerable from the local authority, adds a level of invulnerability for Mr. Jefferson also. Even more so, he seems to be letting Nathan be in the public eye as far as any suspicious activity goes. We know Mr. Jefferson is involved, but only Nathan is seen buying drugs, only Nathan is driving to the barn in his own car, Nathan is paying for the parties, and Nathan's family has supplied the money to build the darkroom. In fact, were it not for David Madsen having tailed Mr. Jefferson, we would literally have no tangible proof that Mr. Jefferson is involved at all. He's even made Nathan use burner phones to contact him, requested he not mention his name in public, and doesn't even so much as sign the notes he leaves for him. If the argument is that it could be his father who left him this note, I would then ask why he would sign every other letter or email addressed to Nathan. And if remaining disconnected from Nathan and the darkroom activities was a main concern, well, then why do we see a contract for the building of the bunker signed by Sean Prescott, right? It doesn't quite fit. I made a video discussing David's coordinates, mapping out Arcadia Bay, and highlighting suspicious activity. If you'd like to check it out, the link will be in the description box. So how has he convinced Nathan to go along with all this? It's important to note that Mr. Jefferson has a way of making people feel special. He understands them, they can confide in him, or relate to him, or know he's looking out for their best interest. He does this to many people. We see it often with Max, but we also hear about it from Victoria, like when she says Mr. Jefferson compares her work to a famous photographer who he knows she admires, or like Stella, who was hired for the Vortex Club End of the World party because she claims Mr. Jefferson knows she needs the extra money. He also does this in the principal's office at the end of episode 2, when he seems to take Max's criticism of him, making Kate upset quite seriously, even placing some extra blame on himself and genuinely looking like he feels guilty, and then goes on to suggest that Max and Nathan need a break because they've been through a lot. I feel like this is part of the persona he projects. Nathan is a neglected teenager who is suffering from some kind of mental disorder. I don't want to say those are the only reasons, but think about his frame of mind. If he's not desperate for approval, then why is he clinging to a silly Best Son award given to him several years ago by his father? Why is he conflicted and distressed and feeling like he needs to prove himself? I think Mr. Jefferson treating him like an adult and telling him he's going to teach him everything he knows is probably the highest amount of attention and regard anyone has given Nathan in a long time. I think Mr. Jefferson is manipulative and cunning and uses these weaknesses in Nathan so that he can use him, and in doing so he's created a source of power and money that would have otherwise been far beyond his reach. So, what are the characteristics of a psychopath? I've already named a few earlier in this video. They are charismatic smooth talkers who are ingenuine, which is also referred to as superficial charm. They lack empathy, are cunning pathological liars who have no remorse and have a largely overinflated sense of self-worth, meaning they often feel their actions are justified or serve a higher purpose. With that said, I'll take my next leap. Is it then possible to assume Mr. Jefferson is a serial killer? Now bear with me, because even if this is not even remotely the case, it's incredibly interesting to consider. Let's be clear, I'm not suggesting his plan was ever to kill. Instead, I'm asking if according to his behavior and actions, we are able to technically consider him a serial killer. What classifies a serial killer? A serial killer is generally someone who murders 3 or more people. However, some disregard this and say it's more like 2 or more with a significant break in between murders. Now, how many people Mr. Jefferson has killed is sort of debatable. We know for sure he's killed Chloe. It was a very quick and decided action, if you recall. And he also seems to be responsible for Rachel's death from what we see at the end of episode 4, though we don't know this for certain, and if Kate is dead in your playthrough, I suppose it could be argued that he's indirectly responsible, if you consider basically leading someone to their suicide, murder that is. I understand many factors went into Kate's suicide, including bullying from her peers, but that's just the surface. What put her in that position to begin with? Why was Kate behaving out of character to begin with? Why does Kate not recall the majority of the night's events? Whether or not Mr. Jefferson planned to watch Kate in her misery, perhaps even photographing her until she hit rock bottom, like photo documenting his victims, is not clear. Serial killers also tend to have sexual contact with their victims, and while there are hints that he possibly had relationships with his victims, whether or not anything sexual was involved in the darkroom is not known. Thanks to David's coordinates, we do know that Mr. Jefferson and Nathan were in the darkroom with Kate for around 4 to 5 hours, at least, before returning her home the next morning. We don't know how many pictures were taken or what is done to them specifically, or even if the pictures get worse than what we are able to see, but an entry in Max's journal suggests there is definitely more to it than what we see. Serial killers usually kill for psychological gratification, whose motives can include thrill, financial gain, anger, and attention seeking, to name a common few. Their victims also usually have something in common, such as age group, gender, race, and so on. So obviously we know Mr. Jefferson's type are teenage girls. They can also be categorized under organized, disorganized, and a mix of the two. Seemingly thus far, he's been very organized. Everything has been planned specifically, his victims are chosen, and then a plan is carried out for their abduction. There's also signs that he's descending into the disorganized category as things continue and he struggles to keep things under the surface, which is also common among serial killers. Now, I talked in my Rachel Amber theory about how creepy I found it that there were newspaper clippings in the darkroom about Rachel and Kate, almost like they were following their crimes in the media or taking pride in their actions. As it happens, this is also common among serial killers. I also want to note that if the red binders were simply photo portfolios, why would they contain so much writing, like in what we see here in Kate's binder? It is not common to see this in portfolios, where generally a few brief words are used to describe the pictures, if any at all. Serial killers can be socially adequate, have friends and lovers and even families, including children, and can be upstanding members of their communities. These are the types of serial killers who, in court, are often described by the people who knew them as unlikely to hurt anyone. I assume by now Nathan Prescott being the main villain is way out of the picture, but if you still have that theory, and perhaps think he could fit the description of a psychopath or serial killer, it's important to note that the main difference between people with other major mental disorders and psychopaths is the psychopath's ability to seem normal and charming, almost like wearing a mask. Nathan does not wear a mask, to say the least. He goes through stages of seeming calm and normal, and in a matter of moments is severely emotionally distressed and filled with rage, often leading to publicly violent threats and behavior. This does not fit a psychopath's characteristics. With the crazy accusations out of the way, I'd like to discuss Mr. Jefferson's possible romantic relationships being a common link between Rachel and Kate. Rachel is rumored to have slept with Mr. Jefferson, but it was this reaction in episode 2 that really led me to believe that it was more than just a rumor.
All her missing persons posters around, it's hard not to think of her.
Rachel was nothing like Kate. Miss Rachel too. But think about yourself.
There's also the letter Rachel wanted to give to Chloe about her relationship with an older man and we can assume this could be Mr. Jefferson, though it could just as likely be about Frank. But if we read the letters Rachel gave to Frank, it's not really clear what the relationship status might have been before she went missing. It could have been the case of her being involved with both of them simultaneously, which would match the Twin Peaks reference I noted in my theory video about Rachel Amber. Or she could have dated Frank, then Mr. Jefferson right after, or perhaps even the other way around, as she does tell Frank in one letter to him that she's going through weird things in her life and she's glad to have him for it. There's also the pictures we can find in Samuel's shed that look very similar to Mr. Jefferson's style. I would think this would be inappropriate to privately photograph your teenage high school students, but maybe not. Then there's Kate. She seems to be going through something even before the party, as we can see a text exchange between Max and Kate, but Max seems to be worried about Kate at least a little bit. There's also this conversation that seems really intense, which begs me to ask why she would go to Mr. Jefferson in particular about a subject like this in the first place. I mean, I know she admires him, but sharing something you're embarrassed about with a male teacher that you pretty much worship would be much harder than sharing it with, say, a female teacher or even the principal. But she goes to Mr. Jefferson instead. And then there's this, when Max interrupts their conversation. I mean, I think that speaks for itself, or maybe I'm looking into this with a bias that leads me to see more than what's there, but this does not seem like a strictly student-teacher conversation to me at all. Either way, it's interesting. In regards to the possibility of the Prescott family being the lead of this whole incredibly creepy plan, I'll make a video on it soon. There's a whole lot of suggestion that more people know about the upcoming tornado than just Max and Chloe, and if that is the case, then how and why? Would this partnership then be for a perceived higher purpose, or are the Prescotts behind the tornado and all the Arcadia Bay eco-disasters entirely? And would this then mean that killing the girls was possibly never a part of the plan, rather an unfortunate unraveling of circumstance, which would also mean Mr. Jefferson might not be a serial killer and maybe not even a psychopath? Well, it could, but again, I will discuss these in another video. As usual, keep in mind that while I do try to root my theories in facts and evidence, there sometimes is not a whole lot to go off on, so for me, the fun lies in looking at all the angles, and I don't strictly believe in any theory I've made to be the one right answer to the missing pieces in the plot. I actually would thoroughly enjoy the story taking a twist and being more than just this whole "don't trust the authority figures, psychopath kills because he's a psychopath" story. Either way, I just enjoy sharing my thoughts and slightly obsessive research. Please do comment if you agree with the theory or have a theory of your own. I love to read them. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and would like to see more in the future.